Thank you for the warm welcome, Theo. I'm really happy to participate in the multilingual lecture series. So thank you so much for the invitation. So hello from Greece and hello everybody and Happy New Year. Today I'm going to talk about bilingualism effects in language and cognition in children with autism spectrum disorder. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So the main objective of the talk is to present data from longitudinal and cross-sectional studies about the effect of bilingualism on the language and cognitive skills of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. But besides the effect of bilingualism, that is being exposed to two languages since birth, I will also refer to the joint effect of two proxies for language experience. So I will see the effects, I will show you data from the effect of bilingualism, as well as the effect of socioeconomic status on the language and cognitive skills of children with autism spectrum disorder. So as I said, I will focus on two proxies for language experience, bilingualism and socioeconomic status, which in these studies, at least, has been measured in terms of the children's maternal education. So before moving to the data and the findings of the actual studies, let me first present some data about the effects of bilingualism in the language skills of children of typical development. So there is a considerable body of research showing that bilingualism has a detrimental effect on typically developing children vocabulary skills. And so many studies have shown a small to medium negative effect of bilingualism on the vocabulary skills of typically developing children, which has been attributed to the limited linguistic input when only one language is taken into consideration. On the other hand, when cumulative vocabulary is considered, that is, when cumulative exposure to each language is taken into account after encompassing the vocabulary acquired in preceding periods, then the fact that bilingual typically developing children fall behind their typically developing monolingual peers in vocabulary seems to disappear. So many more studies, of course, have focused on the effect of bilingualism on the cognitive skills of typically developing children, and special emphasis has been placed on the executive function skills of these children, as well as their theory of mind skills. So what is theory of mind? So theory of mind is a social cognitive skill that allows individuals to take into consideration the beliefs, the emotions, the intentions, the mental states in general of other individuals. Bilingualism has been shown to have a positive effect on typically developing bilingual children's theory of mind skills, which has been mainly attributed to the fact that bilingual children tend to take other individuals' beliefs and intentions into considerations on a constant basis, mainly because they need to adjust their speech to the language of other interlocutors that may only be able to speak one of the child's two languages. The effect of bilingualism on theory of mind skills and typically developing children has been shown in many studies. On the other hand, there has been almost consistency in the effect of bilingualism in the non-verbal executive function skills of typically developing children. So executive functions can be subsumed under the general cognitive umbrella term cognitive control, which is a multi-level cognitive mechanism that enables us to pre-plan our actions in order to achieve a goal with the least possible effort, following the least possible steps. So there are many executive function subcomponents, including attention or working memory, inhibition, planning, cognitive flexibility, and most of the studies that have found an effect of bilingualism in typically developing children's executive functions have highlighted that this effect is positive. This advantage has been attributed to the fact that bilingual children need to juggle two linguistic systems. So they constantly need to inhibit one language when they need to use the other language. So this condition has been shown to be transferred to children's executive function abilities. But the most interesting thing is that there have been studies showing that the positive effect of bilingualism in typically developing children's theory of mind skills has been shown to be mediated by executive function. So there seems to be a very interesting interconnection between theory of mind skills and executive function skills. So which are the executive function subcomponents which have been shown to have a positive effect on children's theory of mind skills? It's inhibition, that is our ability to suppress distracting stimuli or stimuli that are not relevant to current task demands. Cognitive flexibility, that is our ability to shift our attention between different tasks of various demands. And working memory, that is our ability to store and store and process at the same time various types of information. So how would executive functions help one's theory of mind? And how is the advantage of bilingualism conferred on theory of mind skills be mediated by one's executive function skills? So I will present a very widely known example that tests first order theory of mind, the Salian test. I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiarized with this test. So it is an experiment that is widely used in autistic populations in order to investigate whether the child is able to attribute a belief to another person, to suppress his or her own perspective and adopt the perspective of the protagonist of this experiment. So there are two characters, Sally and Anne, and Sally puts her ball in the basket and leaves the room. While Sally leaves the room, Anne is alone and takes the ball from the basket and puts it in the box. So in the end, the child is asked to decide, the child participant is asked to decide where will Sally look for her ball when she comes back. So let's see some of the most representative executive function subcomponents that are implicated in the child participant's decision. So the child needs to hold in his or her working memory all the events, the sequence of events that I have just briefly reported. Also, the child has to suppress his or her own natural impulse or tendency to focus on the location where the object is, so that the child may be able to adopt the perspective of Sally. So there are many executive function subcomponents, cognitive flexibility as well, that are in intricate relationships with each other in order for the child to be able to suppress his own perspective and adopt the mental state of Sally and give the appropriate response. Where will Sally look for the ball when she comes back to the room? So besides bilingualism, I will also present some very recent data about the effect of another proxy for language experience, mainly socioeconomic status, on the cognitive skills of bilingual and monolingual autistic children. So there have been many studies that have shown that children, typically developing children coming from low SES environments, low SES households, tend to fall behind They're more advantaged, says peers, in a variety of standardized language ability tests, including morphology and expressive vocabulary and syntactic comprehension, as well as cognitive skills, including working memory, attention, and inhibition. There have been, so several pathways have been claimed to mediate the effect of SES on children's language and cognitive skills, including child's characteristics and the quality of the interactions between the child and the parents, or the availability of learning resources. So all these different pathways highlight the complex relationship between a child's learning environment and the child's language learning skills and cognitive skills as well. So why SES? So we have run a number of research designs examining the effect of bilingualism in children with atypical language development, using several experimental paradigms, including theory of mind and narratives. And I will show you some of these findings today. But none of these studies included socioeconomic status as an independent factor in these studies. We always tried to match experimental groups on their socioeconomic status, which was quantified in terms of maternal education, but we only treated bilingualism as an independent factor. So all the groups were matched on SES. But what happens when there is a difference between groups in terms of SES? So is bilingualism the only proxy of language experience that should be taken into account when studying effects of bilingualism in language and cognition? Or how does bilingualism interact with SES when studying cognition and language in children with atypical language and cognitive development? So there is a kind of a paucity of research regarding the role of socioeconomic status in children with non-typical language and cognitive characteristics, in our case, in children with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So I will present you a very recent study that looks at the joint effects of SES and bilingualism in children with autism, and the way that SES and bilingualism affect their intelligence skills. Why autism and why study bilingual children? First of all, autism is a widely known public health concern, and its prevalence is steadily increasing. I mean, there has been a very recent study, epidemiological study in Greece by Thamaido and colleagues in 2020, and it actually reveals that the prevalence of autism in Greece is around 2.5%. It is widely known public concern. And why study bilingualism? Because use of 2 or more languages is the norm for over half of the world's population. So the first studies that I'm going to present investigate whether bilingualism has a mitigating effect on classic autistic features in both language and cognition, with the further implication of encouraging parents, carers of autistic children, and in general social stakeholders to promote bilingualism with their children. At least in Greece, there seems to be parents are discouraged from exposing their children to both languages, and even well-intentioned clinicians discourage parents from exposing their children to both their languages, which has cascading negative effects on the child's emotional well-being, the input of the linguistic input that the child receives, the social as well as the professional opportunities that a bilingual child could enjoy later on in his or her life. So can bilingualism help children with autism? Can bilingualism mitigate difficulties that autistic children face in language and cognition? And more specifically, can bilingualism mitigate hallmark features in autism, such as theory of mind impairments and executive function impairments? I will not go into detail as far as these studies on theory of mind deficits and executive function deficits in autism are concerned. But of course, the hallmark feature in autism is the pragmatic feature, that is producing and comprehending language within context. Theory of mind skills are also notoriously known to be deficient in autism, even in high functioning autism. I mean, in children having no structural language deficits. Executive function deficits is another very popular theory that has been put forth to explain autistic traits. For example, I believe that most of you are familiarized with autistic children's local or detail processing style. The first data set, the first findings that I'm going to present investigate the possibility that bilingualism will mitigate these difficulties in these two domains, that is theory of mind and executive functions. So I will present first cross-sectional data on the effects of bilingualism in theory of mind, executive functions, and intelligence in children with autism, and also present the results of bilingual and monolingual autistic children's performance in basic linguistic skills, including vocabulary and syntax. And I will also present some very recent longitudinal data presenting the performance data of monolingual and bilingual autistic children in two theory of mind tasks having different degrees of difficulty. And finally, I will also present quite recent data, longitudinal data on monolingual and bilingual children's vocabulary development. So the first study included 4 groups: monolingual and bilingual typically developing children and monolingual and bilingual autistic children. So the mean age was around 11 years old. You may see that there were significant differences between groups in socioeconomic status, which was measured in terms of maternal education, with respect to that. So the overwhelming majority of bilingual autistic children, as well as typically developing children, had Albanian as their heritage language. And the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised was also used as a diagnostic tool. So the experimental tasks administered to the 4 groups were an expressive vocabulary task in Greek, as well as a sentence repetition task. There were 2 executive function tasks. I will explain them later. And there was also a minimal that examined children's ability to attribute beliefs to other individuals using video scenarios. So if you watch on the expressive vocabulary task, in Greek, it includes 50 white and black pictures, and the child needs to name each picture. It has been standardized for monolingual Greek-speaking children aged 3 to 10, while in sentence repetition, we have 10 sentences of various degrees of structural complexity, coordinate sentences, relative clauses, passive sentences. So there were just 10 sentences. We all know that sentence repetition taps into both morphosyntactic knowledge and verbal working memory skills. And these are the results from these two screening language tasks. So on the left, you may see the 4 groups' performance in the expressive vocabulary task. The maximum accuracy score was 50. So there was a significant bilingualism effect, since both bilingual groups with and without autism, they have scored, no, I mean, it was only bilingual autistic children that scored significantly lower than the monolingual autistic peers. So there was no significant difference between monolingual and bilingual typically developing children, but monolingual autistic children tended to score lower than their typically developing monolingual peers. So there was an autism effect. In sentence repetition, there was no significant group effect. There was only a marginally significant effect, which stemmed from the fact that here the maximum accuracy score is 30. So there was a marginally significant effect that stemmed from the fact that bilingual autistic children scored slightly lower than their monolingual autistic peers. But there was no significant group effect. Now, moving on to the executive function tasks. So the first task was an attention switching task. So this task included 4 types of shapes. So you can see that it included X's, squares, triangles, and circles. So the child viewed in the center of the screen one of these shapes. Now, you may see that each shape includes smaller shapes. So, for example, you may see that the second X consists of small squares. So the instruction, this was an online task run with ePrime. So the instruction was that the child decides on the number of lines formulating the shape. So for X, you need 2 lines. For a square, you need 4 lines. For the triangle, you need 3 lines. And for the circle, you need 1 line. So the child had to decide about the number of the lines formulating the shape. So this task actually included 3 blocks. The first block was the global block. So the child had to decide about the number of lines formulating the big shape, the global shape. So if it was 1 line, if it was a circle, the child had to press a button on a response box. So if it was an X, the child had to press 2. So the second block was the local block. In this block, the child had to decide about the number of lines formulating the small shape within the global shape. So, for example, if you look at the semi-final circle in the local block, the child had to press 3, right? Because the semi-final circle consists of triangles. So the child had to press 3. So the child had to focus on the local shapes and inhibit the global shape. The third block was the global to local switching block, which was the most demanding one in processing terms, because in half of the trials, the child had to focus on the global shape, and in the rest of the trials, the child had to focus on the local shape. So the child had to constantly switch attention from the global to the local shape, and so on and so forth. So the data which were of interest in this study was the third block. And what we computed actually was the cost that the child experienced in 2 conditions. In the condition where the child had to move from the global to the local shape, and the local to global cost condition where the child had to switch attention from the local to the global cost. So we have computed the cost, the processing cost reflected in both accuracy drop or in reaction times each time the child had to switch attention either from the global to the local level or from the local to the global level. So I'm going to present you the switching costs that the children experienced in this task. So I'm only going to present data from accuracy. So on this figure on the left, so you may see the costs that the groups have experienced when having to switch attention from a global shape to a local shape. So it is the global to local cost. And you can see that the group that has experienced the lowest cost when having to switch from the global feature to the local feature was the monolingual autistic group. While the rest of the groups, I mean, bilingual autistic children, monolingual and bilingual typically developing children have experienced significantly higher cost than the monolingual autistic group. Now, in the figure on the right, you may see the costs that the four groups have experienced when having to switch from the local shape to the global shape. That is when I have to disengage my attention from the small shape to focus on the global shape. So here you can see that monolingual autistic children were by far the group that have experienced the most processing cost. I mean, their accuracy abruptly dropped in this condition because which implies that they could not easily disengage their attention from the small shape to pay attention to the global picture. So the two autistic groups did not pattern the same in this executive function task. Now, the second executive function task was a really difficult one, was a two-back task, a two-digit back task. It is a task which is very demanding because it taps into various executive function subcomponents, including cognitive flexibility and working memory and inhibition. So in this task, the child sees a series of digits. So each digit appears on its own in the center of the computer screen. And the child has to decide whether a digit has appeared 2 positions back in the row. So for example, here the child says 2, then he says 5, and then he says 8, then he says 5. So since the digit 5 has appeared 2 positions back in the row, the child had to press a pre-specified key on the keyboard. So the child had to press J. Okay, so there was a composite accuracy score, which emerged from subtracting false hits from correct hits. So I'm going to, reaction times were also recorded on correct hits, but yeah, I'm going to present you data from both accuracy and reaction time measures. So you can see that the scores here are presented in percentages. As I said, it is a really demanding task. So you can see that the accuracy percentages of all 4 groups are below 50%, which actually reflects the great difficulty of this task. So you may see that there was a significant group effect, which actually stemmed from the fact that the bilingual autistic children had the highest accuracy among all groups. And qualitatively, a qualitative piece of information is that the false hits made by the bilingual autistic children was close to 0. So for the rest of the groups, there was a considerable number of false hits, but for the bilingual autistic children, for some reason, false hits were close to 0. Moving on to the reaction times, you may see that there was no significant group effect. So the 2 autistic groups also pattern differently in the second executive function task. Now, moving on to the social cognitive skills of the children. So we know that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that is characterized by great heterogeneity, at least in language abilities. So when using verbal theory of mind tasks, the big question is whether we're actually measuring the language abilities of the children or the pure executive or the pure theory of mind skills of these children. So to be able to do away with the confound of language skills, so we tried to measure children's first order theory of mind abilities by using a minimally verbal theory of mind task. It was not a pure non-verbal theory of mind task because of the instructions and because there was a specific question asked to the child, but it was a minimally verbal theory of mind task. So to cut a long story short, this task, which has been adapted for Jordan and Ramu, includes 19 different scenarios. So each scenario includes an agent who is involved in a particular situation. As the story progresses, a change takes place in this story. Critically, this change is either witnessed by the protagonist, by the agent of the story, or it's not witnessed by the protagonist of the story. So when the story ends, it may end in two different ways, So these two different ends correspond to two different outcomes that critically are either matched or not the agent's belief. And I will show you concrete examples of this task. So, for example, in this scenario, you can see the woman watering the first pot and then trying to water the second one, but there's no water left in the watering can. So she goes back to the tap to fill her watering can. You can see the change phase here, the switching of the location of the two flower pots. So the agent comes back, and then the child would view two different endings of this scenario. For example, this is one of the two ends of this scenario, which is the appropriate one, right? Because the agent has not experienced, has not witnessed the change in the location of the two flower pots. So when she comes back, she will naturally try to water the flower pot on her right. And this is the different ending, the inappropriate end. Okay, so the child was asked the following question: is the end of the story appropriate or not? So the child had to press 1 on a response box if the end of the story was appropriate, and 0 in case the end was inappropriate. But these conditions have to do with the children's ability to handle mental states of the protagonist. But we first had to secure the baseline that the autistic children first needed to handle world facts. So this baseline actually was secured by also using, from Forgeot, Dark, and Ramu, video scenarios where the two possible ends were exclusively explained in terms of physical causation, nature's laws, and not by trying to adopt the perspective, the mental state of other individuals. So, for example, this was one of the potential so-called mechanistic ends that as I said, were used to make sure that the children could interpret physical events that had nothing to do with capturing the mental state worlds of the protagonists. So it's the flower pot on the right that leaks, and this is an inappropriate end because it was the other flower pot that was watered in the first place. So these are the results, the accuracy percentages of the 4 groups. So you may see that the monolingual autistic children has scored lower in the particular task as compared to the rest of the experimental groups. The bilingual autistic children have also scored lower than their typically developing bilingual children, yet the bilingual autistic children have scored significantly higher than their monolingual autistic peers, while there was no significant group effect on mechanistic trials, and you can see this by looking at the figure on your right. So it was just monolingual autistic children's difficulty to interpret and to attribute beliefs to the protagonist of the story that caused the greatest difficulty, while they were able to explain facts in terms of physical causation, as was reflected in their very high accuracy score in the mechanistic trials. And of course, this held for all groups. They all did well in the mechanistic trials. So we next ran some regression and some correlation analysis. Since we had the results from the language ability tests, vocabulary and sentence repetition. So we have run some correlation analysis in order to see which were the most significant factors that contributed to each group's theory of mind accuracy in the minimally verbal theory of mind task. So you can see that bilingual children with and without autism sort of patterned alike. So socioeconomic status and the performance in the attention shifting executive function task, as well as the performance in the 2-back task, were correlated with bilingual children's theory of mind performance, while for monolingual autistic children, it was only their performance in the sentence repetition task that seemed to load on their accuracy performance in the minimally verbal theory of mind task. Which implies that monolingual and autistic, monolingual autistic and bilingual autistic children seem to draw on different resources while performing in the minimally verbal theory of mind task. Now, I will move on to longitudinal, to cross-sectional data that look into the joint effects of bilingualism and socioeconomic status on the intelligence skills of autistic children. So in this study, we have tried to see whether monolingual and bilingual autistic children cluster together when their intelligence profiles are under focus, and see whether there would be any difference between monolingual and bilingual autistic children and the way that socioeconomic status loads on monolingual and bilingual children's intelligence profiles. So a few words on the intelligence profile of monolingual autistic children, which has been extensively explored in the past. So what do they converge upon? Of course, there's great heterogeneity in autistic children's intelligence profile, as well as in their language skills and their language abilities. But the common pattern that keeps emerging is that there is a striking asymmetry between the children's verbal skills, language-mediated skills, which systematically falls behind their visual spatial abilities, which is termed performance IQ in formal tools that have been extensively used to measure the intelligence of these individuals. The overwhelming majority of autistic children seem to have an intact or superior than normal performance IQ score, that is non-verbal intelligence skills, better than their language abilities. So there has been a study by Silleres and colleagues that has explored intelligence profiles in autism. So she has come up with two clusters. In the first cluster, there were monolingual, there were children having language impairment and intact nonverbal IQ skills, while there was a second cluster having children with low performance IQ and intact language skills. Interestingly, bilingualism did not seem to play a defining role in clustering these children. So there were about 50 children in total, 37 monolingual autistic children and 14 bilingual children. So she has come up with these two clusters, but she has not examined the role of socioeconomic status and how this loads into clustering the intelligence profiles of these individuals. So as a follow-up study, we had a significantly larger sample comprising 316 autistic children, more specifically 170 monolingual autistic children and 146 bilingual autistic children. So there was a clear difference in their SES, in their socioeconomic status, since the bilingual autistic children had higher SES than their monolingual peers. I should say here that the common pattern found across studies is the opposite, that bilingual children tend to come from more disadvantaged households than monolingual children, typically developing children at least. But in the region where data was collected, it was the other way around, since autistic children, monolingual autistic children, came from mountainous regions of central Greece, where the families are close to poverty thresholds, while especially the mothers of bilingual autistic children were mothers having high school education and in many cases even university education. So the socioeconomic status of the bilingual autistic children in this study was significantly higher than the socioeconomic status of the monolingual autistic children. So this is a screenshot of the tool that we have used to measure intelligence skills in the two groups, the monolingual and the bilingual autistic children. This is the Greek version of the Wetzler Intelligence Scales for Children, WISC, the third edition. So you can see that there are two basic scales. On the left, you can see the tests that comprise children's verbal IQ scores, while on the right, you can see the tests that comprise the performance IQ, that comprise the performance IQ tests. That is, tests that are not language mediated. So in most of the children that have participated in this study, there was a striking asymmetry between verbal IQ and performance IQ scores, which, as I have already said, is a common pattern. It is considered to be a classic, a hallmark feature in autism and studies that focus on the IQ scores of these children. Now, this slide is kind of overloaded, but I will try to focus on the most relevant aspects of this study, aspects that are relevant to the mediating effect of socioeconomic status. So we have come up with 5 clusters. So the first cluster included children having above average verbal and nonverbal IQ. Nonverbal IQ, it can also be termed performance IQ, PIQ. So the second cluster was characterized by this asymmetry because children had low nonverbal IQ and average verbal IQ. In the third cluster, we had children whose intelligence was borderline. So it included children that had mild mental retardation, since both verbal and nonverbal IQ score were low, below normal levels. The fourth group included children having average nonverbal IQ and low verbal IQ. And the fifth cluster included children that presented with average verbal and nonverbal IQ scores. Now you can see the distribution of the monolingual autistic children, and you can see that 25%, 1/4 of these children presented with above average verbal and nonverbal IQ. 26% were characterized by an asymmetric intelligence profile, and more specifically low PIQ and average verbal IQ, while the rest fell under the group that was characterized by low verbal IQ and low performance IQ. We're talking about the children suffering from mild cognitive mental retardation. On the other hand, the bilingual children presented with the following distribution pattern. You may see that most of them were clustered under the first and the fifth cluster. That is either bilingual autistic children presented with above average verbal and performance IQ, or average verbal and performance IQ. You may see that very few children, almost 11% of them, presented with this striking asymmetry between performance IQ and verbal IQ, which is indicative of classic autism, at least when somebody investigates autistic children's intelligence profiles. So we next ran a mediation analysis. We wanted to see the joint effect of socioeconomic status and bilingualism on the IQ scores of monolingual and bilingual autistic children. So we found that bilingual autistic children outperformed their monolingual peers in both verbal IQ and performance IQ scores, but this effect did not generalize to children from all CES levels. Actually, there was a positive effect of bilingualism in the intelligence skills of autistic children, but this held only for autistic children coming from low CES bilingual environments. So we have split this effect by WISC IQ tests. So you may see that, for example, in the verbal IQ component of the WISC, you may see that low CES bilingual autistic children did better in similarities and arithmetic than their monolingual peers, while the differences were more striking in performance IQ, and you may see here the tests that made the difference. There was only a single verbal IQ test where the pattern was the reverse, that is, monolingual autistic children did better than their bilingual autistic peers, and this was the comprehension subtest, which was really interesting because this test actually does not tap into structural language comprehension, but it taps into social comprehension, since the child is asked to morally judge specific situations, or to decide about the pragmatic appropriateness of certain situations. So, for example, what would you do if you found a wallet on the screen, or on the street, or what would you do if you saw smoke coming out of the window? So, of course, it taps into somebody's language abilities, but this test also mainly taps into social comprehension skills. So this was the only test where one can see that monolingual autistic children outperformed their bilingual peers. But for the rest of the test, it was the other way around. There was a bilingualism effect for low CES bilingual autistic children. So the take-home message from this study is that bilinguals with autism fell into clusters characterized by either average VIQ and PIQ scores or above average VIQ and PIQ scores respectively. So we may suspect that bilingualism actually mitigates the striking asymmetries that are indicative of classic autism in studies focusing on children's intelligence skills. But crucially, the positive effect of bilingualism was strong across both the verbal and especially the non-verbal skills of the children, but only from children coming from low socioeconomic households. How much time do I have?
Eleni, you only have 5 minutes.
Okay, so can I just present the longitudinal data? It will take me about 10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. So this is a study, a joint study by simply myself, Stephanie Durleman, and Margriet Volgesang on longitudinal data from monolingual and bilingual autistic children being tested on a verbal theory of mind tests, but two different theory of mind tests in terms of the verbal demands that they pose. So monolingual, and we didn't have typically developing children in this study. There were only two groups of monolingual and bilingual autistic children that were tested at 3 time points, 6 years, 9 years, and 12 years. So they were matched on SES. There were differences in their performance IQ scores, and I will move on to the tests. Their language abilities, for example, their expressive vocabulary was tested with expressive vocabulary test in Greek that I've shown you before. And there was an executive function task, the 2-back task that I have also shown you before. So the first low verbal theory of mind task is the famous Salian test. That tests first order theory of mind, the attribution of beliefs to another individual. So we have acted out this task with the children. So it is a verbal task, but it's not that demanding. I mean, it's not the case that it includes a vignette or a story, that it has a very heavy morphosyntax and rare vocabulary. And we have also used a more heavy, a more language-loaded theory of mind task from Autistic Tom Pelletier Nombre studies. So it included vignettes having more than 100 words. And these stories actually included both first-order theory of mind questions and second-order theory of mind questions. So I will present you the results from Salian task and from children's accuracy performance in the second-order theory of mind questions in these stories, in these short vignettes. So you may see the results from the expressive vocabulary test. So across all 3 time points, bilingual autistic children have scored lower than their monolingual peers. But in the 2-back task, the picture was reversed, since bilingual autistic children have scored significantly higher than their monolingual peers. So you may see here the results from the first-order theory of mind and the second-order theory of mind question. So accuracy is presented in percentages. So you can see that, as I said, both groups were tested at 3 time points. So monolingual autistic children are represented with a green line, while bilingual autistic children are displayed with a blue line. So there were no group differences in first-order theory of mind at either time point, but in second-order theory of mind, you may see that bilingual autistic children have scored higher than their monolingual peers at 2 time points, at age 9 and at age 12. So there were different effects found based on age, because, as I said, the group effect emerged at different time points, at the 2 later time points, and depending on the type of theory of mind. So second order theory of mind is more demanding than first order theory of mind. It represents a more advanced mechanism of mentalizing. We next tried to see whether children's performance in expressive vocabulary and performance IQ score correlated with their performances. So here you can see the way that first order theory of mind in this figure correlated with the children's performance IQ. So you may see that in the first order theory of mind task, in the Salian task, performance IQ correlated with theory of mind performance for both groups and across all 3 time points. But in second order theory of mind reasoning below, you may see that performance IQ correlated with accuracy in second order theory of mind reasoning at time points, at the second and the third time point, at ages 9 and 12 for the bilingual autistic children, but only at age 12 for the monolingual autistic group. And the same pattern was revealed for second order theory of mind reasoning, and the correlations run between accuracy in second order theory of mind and their expressive vocabulary. So you can see that expressive vocabulary boosted bilingual autistic children at age 9 and 12, but only at age 12 for monolingual autistic children. So bear in mind that bilingual autistic children scored lower than their monolingual autistic peers. Yet monolingual autistic children failed to capitalize on this language resource. So theory of mind development was observed in both groups, both monolingual and bilingual children, but bilinguals had performed monolinguals on second order theory of mind at age 9 and 12. So bilingual autistic children showed higher executive functions across all 3 time points. However, they did not seem to draw on this resource on the executive function skills for the theory of mind performance. And bilingual autistic children seem to capitalize more efficiently on the performance IQ and linguistic resources, their expressive vocabulary, to perform in second order and first order theory of mind. So I will skip the longitudinal data on vocabulary. So the studies have shown that bilingualism seems to have a detrimental effect on language, especially expressive vocabulary. Bilingualism has also been shown to have a positive effect on executive functions, especially updating. There seems to be a joint effect of socioeconomic status and bilingualism on autistic children's intelligence skills. So we saw that bilingualism boosts intelligence skills only for low SES bilingual autistic children. And there was a positive effect of bilingualism on, especially on second order theory of mind reasoning in the longitudinal data. But we saw that the resources that bilingual autistic children drew, that is expressive vocabulary and executive functions, were distinct from monolingual autistic children. So it seems that bilingualism has a positive effect on, especially on children's cognitive skills. This actually implies that social stakeholders and families having bilingual autistic children should not be discouraged from exposing their child to the second language. Of course, many more studies are needed to reach firm conclusions and to better and more efficiently integrate socioeconomic status as a second proxy for language experience, and also investigate the mechanisms, the pathways through which socioeconomic status mediates this bilingualism effect in autistic children's cognitive skills. Thank you.